Thank you so much for inviting me. Can you all hear me? Is this working? Okay. It's such an honor to be here in South Africa and at this university, and I admired your struggles here at this campus over the past year. It's really an honor to be here. And I'm excited to talk about what we've been doing in the United States. We rarely have anything good to say about what's coming out of the US, including our presidential election. I just want to give you some of the stories of the resistance that people have been fighting around low-wage work for the last several decades, and hopefully it's of interest to you. So to start out, I just want to give a little context about the US minimum wage. The United States established a national minimum wage in 1938, and it was set at 25 cents an hour. It had no formula behind it, no methodology. There was no way that it would automatically increase with inflation. It took an act of Congress to increase the minimum wage. And so what that meant was, for a while, when unions were strong and social movements were strong, the minimum wage was increasing somewhat regularly. But as labor movements became weak and workers lost power in the 1970s and 1980s, the real value of the minimum wage began to deteriorate. So by the early 1990s, we had a situation in which 25 to 30% of all US workers were working for poverty wages, working even full-time and not earning enough to make the federal poverty line, living in homeless shelters, going to churches for food at the end of the month because their paychecks just didn't stretch out. People began to realize this. In fact, first pastors at churches in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, realized that, oh, a lot of people who are homeless are working. We need to do something about this. But the fact was, we had no power to raise the national minimum wage. This was in the early 1990s, under the first George Bush, and then even under the Democratic President Bill Clinton. There was no appetite for raising minimum wages. This was the time, the fall of the Cold War. Your country knows this period well. We had a real sense that we needed to create policies that privileged businesses and made it easy for businesses to hire and fire. The idea was that raising the minimum wage would be bad for business climate. And so activists turned to the local level because they felt they had no power at the national level, and really not even much power at the state level, but possibly power at the city level, where it was still possible to mobilize voters and social movements to pressure local governments to do something about poverty. Now, at that time, many mayors said to activists, we don't have the authority to establish a minimum wage for the city. We can't do much about it. Activists pushed back, and they began to win something called living wage ordinances. And these were really basically just for cities doing public contracting and procurement. So if a city gave money to a service contractor, or if the city gave money in economic development, that employer was required to pay what we called a living wage, a wage high enough for a worker to meet the federal poverty line. The idea was very popular. Unions were involved, churches, environmentalists, students, even small businesses, and poll after poll showed 70, sometimes 80% of voters supported the idea of raising minimum wages. So cities around the country began to adopt what we called living wage ordinances and pass these across the country. That kind of also spurred states to also pass state minimum wages, because states actually do have the authority to pass minimum wages higher than the national minimum wage. So by the late 1990s, early 2000s, over 130 cities and counties around the country passed local living wage ordinances in an effort to address this very serious problem of working poverty. And so let me note that it was not necessarily that activists, were not national minimum wage. They were. They saw this as the ultimate goal. But they realized that they had to build power, and they had to take a long-term approach to building political coalitions of people that hadn't normally worked together, sometimes ever. Environmentalists and construction unions, for example. But these groups came together around the notion of raising the minimum wage. So what we saw was this was a very popular idea. And at the local level, we could build enough power to pressure local officials to pass these wages, and that could build some pressure to build power at the state level. But at the national level, it was still very difficult. And there's really neither of the two parties, the Republicans nor the Democrats, supported the idea of raising the minimum wage. Still, the movement had success, and into the mid-2000s, even up to the economic crisis, there was a lot of support for the idea. But then 2008 happens, the global recession, and suddenly it seems that the momentum behind raising minimum wages is dead. President Obama runs for presidency on the promise of raising the national minimum wage to $10 an hour, but soon after he comes into office, everyone says there's no way this can happen. There's no way we can raise the minimum wage in the context of a global recession. It seemed as if that was going nowhere. And so we were pretty discouraged, 2009, 2010. It seemed as if we were going to just face a really rampant increase in working poverty and inequality. But then in 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement emerges in New York City and spreads quickly around the United States and somewhat around the world, and demands that that governments or someone pay attention and do something about global inequality. Suddenly, politicians were talking about inequality and revisiting the idea of the living wage. And cities began to consider, again, passing living wage ordinances, but just beginning to slowly pick that up. A year later, 2012, several hundred fast food workers in New York City walk off the job from McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's, and they demand $15 an hour and the right to form a union. Now at that time, the minimum wage in New York was $7.25 an hour, and so workers were walking out and demanding a wage that was more than double the minimum wage. This was extraordinary. I don't know how to convey the surprise that many people had, the shock that workers would demand such a bold increase. But interestingly, they had a lot of support. And these were not traditional strikes in the sense they weren't long and ongoing. They were just a few hours, and a lot of the people involved in the strikes were actually community members who came out to join the picket lines. But within the next few months, the fast food strikes spread across the country, and by the next year, there were coordinated strikes happening in hundreds of cities across the United States, and then also spreading to other kinds of workers beyond fast food, to airports, domestic workers, childcare workers, convenience store workers. And all of these workers were demanding the right to form a union and the right to a $15 an hour minimum wage. At that same time, I should say, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement also began to grow in the United States in response to police brutality and police murders, in response to just persistent ongoing discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement came also boldly protesting and boldly demanding a change to the system, and intersected with the fast food campaign and the fight for 15. In fact, of the low-wage workers in the United States, they are disproportionately people of color, disproportionately women, and contrary to popular opinion, low-wage workers are not just teenagers. The average age of the low-wage worker in the United States is in their 30s, about 32 years old, people with children, people supporting a family. And this was a natural alliance, it became a natural alliance between the Black Lives Matter and the Fight for 15 movements. So suddenly, this notion of the minimum wage was back on the table, and we began to see cities take on the idea of going back and passing not just ordinances addressing city subsidies or city procurement, but to pass laws that covered everyone within the city borders. So in 2012, voters in a small town in Washington called SeaTac passed by ballot a $15 an hour minimum wage covering all workers in the city. Shortly after that, the larger city of Seattle, Washington, the city council passed a minimum wage of $15 an hour. And then suddenly the floodgates were opened, and a host of cities throughout the country began to talk about the notion of the higher wage. Now, I should have clarified that we have a national minimum wage which covers most workers in the country. States are also allowed to set their own minimum wage above the federal. They can't go below the national. And then some states allow cities to set their own citywide. It's a minority of the states, but in some primarily cities on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, cities can set their own wages. So San Francisco, Los Angeles, but also lots of small cities as well, began passing citywide minimum wages of between $10 and $15 an hour. And just earlier this year, the state of California and the state of New York also passed $15 an hour minimum wages, which will be phased in over the next 5 years, but will be covering tens of millions of workers. So this is a dramatic change in the landscape of where we were just 4 or 5 years ago when we thought that there was no chance in raising the minimum wage. Suddenly the momentum is taking off. There's still not clear what's going to happen at the national level. We are kind of on hold until our presidential elections. One of our candidates supports a $12 an hour minimum wage. One candidate supports abolishing the minimum wage. But I should say that the position is not necessarily predictive of what will happen, because in fact, the last time our national minimum wage was raised was under President George Bush in 2006 and 2007, in the wake of the immigrant rights protests happening in the country at that time. So that's just a little context of what's going on to give you a sense of the minimum wage movement and where we're at. What I want to focus on tonight is some about the research and the role of research in this campaign, and then some of the lessons we've learned over the last 20 years about building this movement. So, just checking your voice. Okay. Okay. All right. So, Gil has gone over the economic research that you've all done, that they've done here, and so I won't go into great detail about it. But what I want to tell is the story of how this evolved in the United States in terms of a debate about economic policy. When the minimum wage movement really began to pick up and the living wage campaigning began to pick up in the 1990s, it was considered conventional wisdom, obvious, standard theory that if you raise the minimum wage, unemployment will go up. If you raise the price of the good, the demand goes down, right? So that's what I was taught in all of my economics classes. That's what all of our policymakers learned in their economic classes. And we heard over and over again, that's just economics 101. You have to be an idiot to think otherwise. In fact, some opponents went so far as to say entire industries will move overseas. You will wipe out the economic growth of entire states. And there was just no way we could raise the minimum wage without causing undue harm and hurting the people we were trying to help. Every single newspaper editorial across the United States came out with that position for local living wages. They said, if you raise the wage, unemployment goes up, employers will cut jobs. Every single city council, every single mayor, Democrats, Republicans, pretty much said the same thing. So that was what was understood as standard practice. But what happened is, by building political coalitions and building political power, voters convinced their local legislatures to pass the local living wages, and in some cases state wages, and economists began to actually test the theory. And it's one thing to say our textbook says raising wages leads to unemployment. It's another to go out and actually test it and compare. What happens when the state of New Jersey raises its minimum wage and the state of Pennsylvania doesn't? Let's look at fast food restaurants along the border. If we're going to see any impact, we'd see it there, right? We'd see McDonald's in New Jersey with the higher wage all shutting down or cutting employment, and all the jobs moving to Pennsylvania. But in fact, that wasn't the case. And study after study began to find that these predictions were not holding true. We were not finding increased unemployment. We were not finding rampant inflation. We were not finding employers shutting down and moving to Mexico. So The initial response in the field was that the data must be wrong, the researchers must be lying or making up the data, but study after study continued to come out and actually test what was actually happening. And it continued to show over and over again that, in fact, employers had many ways of adjusting to the higher wage other than laying off workers. So as Gil said, employers could raise prices, and some of them did. So the prices of a hamburger at McDonald's went from $1 to $1.01. The price of an airline ticket in an Oakland airport rose by about $2 per airline ticket. So there was some cost passed through to the customer, but in such a small amount that it was not affecting demand. In some places, employers reported that by paying the higher wage, they had lower turnover, lower absenteeism, and higher productivity, and they were actually regaining some of the cost of the wage increase back in that way. Other employers used the opportunity to streamline some of their inefficient production, and some of them had to take lower profits or stabilize their managerial salaries and top-end salaries. So they used a variety of coping mechanisms to cover the cost of the higher wage, and as a result, we did not find any of the predicted negative impacts that our textbooks told us we would find. Now, it's important to really look deeply and say, are there other impacts? One of the concerns was, would employers begin to replace their existing workforce with a different workforce? Would they, for example, fire all the people of color and start hiring white people? Would they begin to hire everyone without a high school diploma and start hiring people with higher degrees? For the most part, we didn't find that to be happening, and so evidence was not there for that kind of substitution. The other concern was, would employers begin to replace their employees with machines, with technology? And again, we weren't finding evidence of this. Why is that? We hear over and over again, if you increase the wage, McDonald's is just going to put robots on all the counters. You may have heard that already. That's certainly one of the claims. The fact is, employers have always, from the beginning of time, tried to use technology to replace workers. That's a constant battle. But technology is expensive, it breaks down a lot, it's not perfect, and often customers revolt. Many supermarket chains found when they implemented a computerized checkout that the customers didn't like it at all, and they actually went back to using people for most of their checkout services. So the battle of technology is real, it's there, we can't discount it, but we're not finding wide-scale evidence that employers are using this as a strategy to deal with the higher wage. And so it's just something that, in part, because these are often very expensive changes and the wage increases are still not that high. So we were not finding these negative impacts, and in fact, on the other hand, we were finding some fairly positive impacts. One of the most obvious, of course, is the impact on the workers. Now, the reality is the wage increases in these cases were relatively small for the firm. For the average firm affected, the cost of the higher wage amounted to less than 1% of operating costs, a pretty small amount for the average firm. But for the worker, it made a significant impact. Many workers in surveys reported that they could quit their second job, some quit a third job, reported they could pay off debt, in particular medical debt, which is a huge issue in the United States. Some workers reported that they would then be able to enroll in school and pursue another alternative career path. So the impacts on workers were real. The costs for employers were small. We were also seeing other interesting findings. One finding that seems to be emerging in the US is some of the employers saw the opportunity when they had to raise wages, they began to convert some of their part-time jobs into full-time jobs. And what they told us is that if they have to invest in the worker already, and some of the ordinances required providing health care, that they would rather begin to just keep workers on for the long term and invest in that worker. So rather than hiring hundreds of part-time workers to fill 100 jobs, they were moving in the direction of hiring 100 full-time workers to fill those jobs. Now, other research seems to be confirming this fact in Germany, where there's a new minimum wage. And we heard the other night, perhaps in South Africa, some of the research in agriculture suggests this is a trend as well. That when employers are required to pay the higher wage, they may opt to choose what we call the high road model of employment, to say, we're going to invest in our employees long-term, give them training, provide them benefits, give them raises over time, and build career paths. So that's one of the potential directions that this may lead. Another interesting finding is the potential savings for governments by raising the minimum wage. Some of the research has attempted to estimate the degree to which low-wage workers rely on public subsidies. We have everything from subsidized healthcare, housing, energy assistance, childcare policies, tax credits. One study found that low-wage workers utilize about $150 billion a year in public programs in the United States. And what we found is employers like Walmart and McDonald's were actively coaching their employees to go and apply for these benefits. So they hire them on at $7.25 an hour, a wage far below the poverty line, and they say, to make ends meet, you will need to sign up for all these government programs. Now, this is a tricky one because many of us support government programs, and you don't want to present this as a way to eliminate the program's existence. But it's also suggesting that employers have been shifting the costs of employment onto the public sector. So as a way to resist that employer's ability to shift that cost, you raise the wage and make the employer pay more of their share of workers' cost of living. And then another feature of the higher minimum wage, the research suggests there may in fact be at this point enough pressure to begin leading not to job cuts, but in fact to job creation. Now, it's too early to tell, but a Department of Labor study found that the states with higher minimum wages were also the states with greater job creation over the last several years. Now, we don't know cause and effect. This is, again, we can't make that claim yet, but it's possible that by raising wages for low-wage workers, you're putting money into the hands of people who spend that money in their local economy, and that, in fact, can generate aggregate demand, generate job creation. And then the last interesting research finding was, in contrast to the claim that the higher wage would hurt small businesses disproportionately, we found that that wasn't the case, and that in fact many small businesses are already paying above the minimum wage, and that many small businesses report that they support an increase in the minimum wage. A recent poll in fact showed that the majority of small business owners thought raising the minimum wage would be a good idea. Why is that? Again, that's because small businesses, by paying the higher wage, they don't want to have to compete with the large employers that pay minimum wage. They see it as unfair competition. Turnover is very expensive and disruptive for small businesses. They tend to want to keep people on and invest in them in the longer term, and they tend to raise wages over time. So for the small business that's paying somewhat above the minimum wage, they'd rather all employers have to do that. They don't want to have to compete with the large multinationals that compete by paying the lowest wages. Okay, so I will, in terms of a couple of other research findings very quickly, in addition to the economic issues, we found that one of the challenges is that implementation is very difficult. Just because a law is passed doesn't mean it's enforced. And what's interesting is the laws that were passed the quickest and most, without any debate, were the ones least likely to be enforced. In fact, it was those campaigns that were long and contentious, that built broad political support, where workers actually were part of the campaign, that were most likely to be enforced. So what we think is that when community organizations and unions build campaigns and stick around afterwards, they're the ones that can help ensure that the living wages and minimum wages are enforced. The struggle is ongoing. That leads to the other point about unions. Where are unions in this campaign? Well, The unions were some of the early advocates and initiators behind the living wage and minimum wage movement. Some of the unions in the 1930s advocated that by establishing a national minimum wage, you take wages out of competition and you make it so that unions could focus on collective bargaining as a supplement to the minimum wage. So what we've seen is those unions that have utilized the minimum wage strategy have begun to see some impacts of stronger unionization in relation to these campaigns. Now, it may be that we're winning the higher minimum wage because employers want to keep unions out. That's very likely. It's been much easier to win a higher wage than it is a union. But we've also seen in the last few years, alongside the minimum wage victories, we've also had an increase in strike activity in the United States, and we've also had an increase in union density in a couple of places like New York City and New York State. So that's been an interesting direction. Okay, so I'm going to jump now just to the lessons that I would take away from the last few years, 20 years actually, of what we might conclude about the minimum wage work so far. The first is perhaps obvious, but the minimum wage is obviously not a solution on its own. It's a tool, but it's a tool that's part of a larger package of tools. Certainly we still have people who are unemployed. The minimum wage doesn't affect them. People who don't have enough hours of work. And enforcement is an issue. So minimum wage certainly has to be part of a larger package. There's a real concern about differentiating between the deserving poor and the non-deserving poor. Many governments are passing higher wages. At the same time, they are criminalizing poverty and making it more difficult for people who are homeless or panhandling, sleeping on the subways. So minimum wage movements have to be clear that it's a coalition of the employed and unemployed. There cannot be a division between those two categories. A third lesson is that really these campaigns relied on making different arguments for different constituencies. Some people are persuaded by the arguments around dignity of labor and the value of work. Some people are persuaded by the economic arguments of a Keynesian effect of raising wages. Some people are persuaded by the argument of fighting against the global 1% and addressing inequality. It's really, a variety of arguments that work, and that's partly why this notion is so popular, because different aspects of it appeal to different people. A fourth lesson is that this movement really bumped up when the workers took a really bold risk and went from asking for $9, $10 an hour to asking something really big, $15 an hour and the right to form a union. This was inspired, I believe, in part by Occupy Wall Street and the Black Lives Matter movement, that were both efforts to go from defensive to offensive, to begin saying, this is what we need. Not just what's possible, but this is what we're demanding. And I think that took this movement to a whole nother level that raised excitement in a way that we hadn't seen. And in fact, many of the polls showed greater public support for $15 an hour than they did for $12 or $10 an hour. So a lot of voters say, hey, if you're gonna do it right, raise the wage. And then finally, the last thing I would say is that, there's still a long way to go. Even $15 an hour, it's not a living wage in New York City and many other places in the United States. It's not addressing all of our challenges. But what this is an opening to really challenge the standard model that we've had for the last 20 or 30 years. A model that the United States has pioneered and perfected, a model of labor market deregulation and flexibility. And this is really a moment where we can say, hey, enough of that model, it doesn't work. It's not working for anyone. We need something different. The minimum wage is just a piece of that, but it's a way of asserting that our economies should be based on human need and fulfilling what basic human condition, not centered around the business climate and profit. So I think it's exciting to learn all from you how you're resisting this model, and to see these movements that are actually burgeoning around the world in this moment, and hopefully globally we can build another alternative. So thank you very much.